we have a collective interest in not liquidating the well-being introduced to the landscape by beavers. We have a collective interest and a lineage level interest, right?
Right.
Our descendants 5 generations from now depend on the fact that we will not have ignored the equilibrium factor and just depleted at the highest rate possible and then assumed that some process would magically rescue us at the end of that.
Yep.
Right? Those processes sometimes do rescue us, and sometimes they don't, and we can't afford the ones that don't. But anyway, the point is, and this is one of these really important places where there is a discussion that absolutely has to take place between what I would call hard-headed progressives, and I don't want to presume to define you, but I believe you are a hard-headed progressive, as am I, and so-called conservatives. And what I hope will happen is that the conservatives, of whom there are many who are frankly struggling to preserve the gains that 10 years ago we all agreed were good, right? Struggling to preserve, a fair, colorblind society in which everyone has access to the market and, a means to get ahead, in which, merit produces rewards. Conservatives who are doing that job I now find them strangely deaf to the idea that being a conservative also naturally requires us to preserve the substrate on which we all live, right? That the society that does, reward hard work and insight and doesn't give a damn what color your skin is or what your sexual orientation is or any of those other parameters, that society only works if the underlying stuff continues to exist for us to utilize. And in some sense, what I'm getting at is I believe that sustainability is a natural concept that conservatives should embrace. But because of the dialogue about ecology having focused so heavily on global warming, and because there are clearly things wrong with the portrayal of global warming, I don't know, I assume you're not a DarkHorse listener, but Heather and I have navigated this a bunch of times, right? We believe that global warming is real, but we also believe that we are being given a story that's far too black and white to be realistic. That it
does have a high PR budget.
Yeah, it has a very high PR budget, and
my conservative neighbors would point out gives them a certain amount of skepticism.
It is a very good reason for skepticism, and the fact that we know from inside the academy that any time people are in a panic over some process that is threatening them, the chances that the literature represents an accurate exploration of the factors that go in one direction or the other is effectively zero, right? So, I think the point is the models are not the same thing as empirical results, and we are treating those models as empirical results. And those models are always suspect because you can, if you are willing to put enough parameters into a model, you can get it to match any behavior you want. It doesn't mean that you've identified something real, right? It becomes just a self-fulfilling generator of academic papers. But so if we put aside that we know that there's something wrong with the discussion about global warming and that that's dangerous and tragic because we do need to know what the truth of it is, right? But just put aside global warming. The point is that we've got an environmental crisis that has nothing to do with global warming. If global warming were a complete fiction, we would still be in a very dangerous circumstance because of collective action questions in game theory, because of failure to recognize equilibria. And, those things require good governance to solve them. And this is the bitter pill, I think, for libertarianism, right? I have some sympathy with libertarians because I believe they have identified the central value that we should be maximizing, right? Realized liberty is a great value to maximize precisely because it forces you to solve every other issue, right? You can't be free if you are in danger of being wiped out by a medical crisis in your family, right? So if we really tried to maximize how much liberty individuals could actually exercise, then we would have to solve all of these problems, and good governance is required. Of course, at the moment, I don't think anybody who's looking at what our governments are doing can be all that enthusiastic about empowering them, right? So anyway, I've again led us far afield, but...
Well, I think there's an interesting thing here in that if we focus on carbon, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, especially when it's in the air. It's invisible.
Yep. Non-toxic,
No.
Can't see it, doesn't smell.
Maybe something technological will save us.
Yep.
Right? But until then, there's not much anybody can do with the typical toolkit.
Yep.
Whereas if you're thinking about the water cycle and you're thinking about this complex system, there's a lot that each individual human can do to facilitate a shift. I mean, it becomes a land use conversation, right? And it's interesting. I have a lot of friends who are very conservative, and they have a deeper relation to the land, if I'm going to paint with a broad brush, than a lot of my friends who are much more progressive, right? In fact, usually the folks who know the most about beaver are the beaver trappers that are being demonized then by the folks who are trying to save the beaver, right? And yet these folks know more about beavers than a lot of the folks who are raising money for beaver projects, right? But I wonder if there's something with the baseline, the baseline that conservatives are feeling protective of doesn't extend far enough back to prior to when we started the extractive process that is, not going to go too long in the future. Like there's something that's invisible back there when beavers were in charge of water for all of North America. And the conservation tendency, the conservative tendency to like, hey, let's stabilize this system where it's at and just change when we see it necessary. I don't think it sees that. I mean, this was the case when we came in and made national parks, right? The Yosemite is the perfect example where there's these huge, beautiful meadows and these, towering trees. And there was the conservatives of the time were like, there's just this one problem. There's these people who live here.
Right.
And I encountered this with some of the work I did with you and Heather when we were in Panama too, like this tendency to be like, well, let's just get the people out and then this beautiful thing will be retained.
Right, the Awanichi Indians who were in that beautiful
and then
valley.
Now what does that valley look like? Well, is it fully encroached in brush? All those flowers that were the first foods that people were maintaining are diminished, and you realize that was another ecosystem engineer that we took off the landscape. People were in charge of, just as beavers have been methodically managing the waterways, right?
Yep.
People were methodically managing the uplands with fire.
So
we see these collapses, right? But the conservation tendency was blind to the process, blind to the people who were maintaining a productive system with fire, or that beavers were maintaining a productive system with water.
So I don't know. I agree with your diagnosis. There's a willingness to look back a certain distance, but not far enough to really understand that you have stepped into a new realm, and you're failing to whether you're a conservative or a progressive or whatever you are, you're failing to preserve this thing of value. And my sense is that people are basically alike in that they appreciate beautiful places. They appreciate things that don't require intensive work to maintain, right? Give people the opportunity, and everybody looks, at a gorgeous landscape and has a positive feeling about it, right?
Right.
What I don't know what to do about is we start doing something at a small scale inherently. That's how everything starts. And when you are at that small scale, the fact that that process, if you were to extrapolate up to some, immense inflation of that same process, then becomes a threat to your very ability to persist. At what point does it make sense to have that conversation, right? Does it make sense to have that conversation when you're experimenting, on the workbench in your garage with that little process that if it really caught on 100 years later would be an issue? No, right? You should be allowed to experiment. But there is no way that functioning at the scale that we are at, that the right answer to the question doesn't involve, okay, in what way can we rationally rein ourselves in without triggering any of the failure modes, right? Well, if we rein ourselves in and our competitors don't rein themselves in, the place gets destroyed anyway, and we will also have lost out and they will be more powerful than we. Classic tragedy of the commons.
Yep.
That's a problem you have to solve, right? You cannot do this as a matter of personal responsibility. You cannot do this with your nation behaving responsibly and others not behaving responsibly. It has to be done as a matter of some kind of good governance. And I don't know how you would do it at the moment. I'm absolutely terrified of governments having more power because I think they're all malignant. I don't know of a government that I trust at the moment. But, I also don't want to die of that concern because it means, well, we're not going to manage any of the things that have to be managed in order for us to persist. So doesn't this seem like a natural place where conservatives and progressives ought to be talking at this moment about how can we keep doing, how can we continue to have the goose that lays the golden eggs without destroying the world on which it lives?
Yeah. And what I've found doing the work that I do is it is uniting for folks. Like, as long as it can not become a fuzzy animal that needs saved issue. If we can stick to Beaver are a process. This is an intelligent, complex thing that we need to defer to. We need to put the professionals back in charge of our water, because what we've been doing with the water doesn't seem to be working very well, right? That's something that I've found consistently everyone can get on board with. But then you start saying, well, on your land, you now have to make a concession. You have to take those 3 acres out of productivity and allow beavers to return it to wetland. And that's where things get edgy, because people are making livelihoods off this land, right? And it's like, why would I incur the cost to society? Society values a system that's working better, and society values beaver, but then I am, as a landowner, going to incur the cost of that. What's in it for me?